Okay, topic 1.2, the Italian Renaissance. Before we get into the Italian Renaissance, since this is our first lesson in European history, I thought it's important for us to take a look at what Europe looked like in 1400. Now, looking at this map, it can seem a little intimidating, right? Because it doesn't look very much like the modern map of Europe. It looks a lot more complicated. So I'm going to do a swing around Europe here, and I do encourage you in these first couple weeks, if you're not familiar with the geography of Europe, modern Europe, you might want to take a look at it so you know where we're talking about as we go through this class, right? So let's take a swing around Europe and just talk about what's going on politically, just to give ourselves some context here before our first lesson. Now, obviously, at this point in history, coming out of the High Middle Ages, Europe does not have any dominant absolute monarchs that we associate with Europe. We are going to learn in this first unit that we're going to start to see some of these monarchs centralizing their power, trying to subdue the nobles that are also challenging them and wanting their crown, and also finding a way to subdue the peasantry class in this feudal world, right? But if we take a little swing around Europe, let's take a look at some of the families that are going to become dominant by the end of this unit. So we'll start up here in England. At this point, England is just England. It is not Great Britain. It does not control Scotland. It does not control Ireland. England at this point is going to end with a family called the Tudor dynasty taking control by the end of this unit, the Tudors. Okay? Now, France, if you guys took 10th grade world history, you learned that France historically was dominated by the Bourbon dynasty, right? Remember that, some of you? At this point, the Bourbon dynasty has not risen to power. The ruling family, the most dominant ruling family in France at this point is called the Valois. Say it with me, Valois. The Valois family. Good. All right, if we go over to Spain, Spain is also a country that has not centralized power and does not have a centralized monarchy, right? At this point, Spain is divvied up amongst several noble families ruling over the Iberian Peninsula. And Spain is split up into Granada in the south, which was a Muslim kingdom, Portugal in the west, Castile, Aragon, and a small little province called Navarre, which was right on the border of France and always contested between Spain and France. Cool. And as you guys probably have guessed, we'll learn about Ferdinand and Isabella, the ones that funded Columbus's voyage. They were the leaders of Castile and Aragon, so their consolidation of power is going to then lead us towards Spain becoming more of a centralized state. Now, the really interesting parts of this map are the Germanic lands and what are modern day Italy. Definitely disfragmented politically. Today we're going to learn that Italy was chopped up into about 10 kingdoms, with about 5 of them dominating politics. And we'll get into that to our lesson today. And then obviously, Germany is not Germany yet. It is referred to as the Holy Roman Empire, which not only consisted of over 360 different little Germanic speaking city states, which we'll learn some of the bigger ones, more dominant ones, but also the Empire of Austria. And this is the most contested part of Europe. And the ruler over this land, in this case, the royal family were the Habsburgs. The ruler over this land is given the title the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful political entity in Europe at this time, coming out of the Dark Ages. All right. Now, we know that in the Middle East, we have the Ottoman Empire dominating Asia Minor, and we're going to see how the Ottoman Empire is going to push up into the Balkans, all right, start threatening Eastern Europe. We know that at this point, the Scandinavian countries have joined a union where Denmark, Norway, and Sweden have declared the Kalmar Union, and they are one entity, okay? But eventually, we're going to see different royal families start taking control of this region, right? The Vasas will come out of Sweden and take control of Polish Lithuania. The Oldenburgs will take control of Denmark. we'll get a little deeper into that in later units. And then at this point, we know that the Vasily family is ruling over Russia, and eventually we'll learn the story how eventually the Romanov family will wrestle control of that from the Vasilis under the tutelage of people like Peter the Great. So that's kind of just, I don't expect you to obviously remember all of that, but just to kind of give you an idea of what's going on politically at this point in history. Economically, we know that sea trade was very important. So we're going to see the revival of the Mediterranean Sea Trade Network. And the Mediterranean Sea Trade Network that was centered in a lot of the Italian city-states is going to start to challenge the Northern Sea Trade Network known as the Hanseatic League. All right. So just a nice overview politically and economically. Now let's get into our lesson that we're going to dive into the next 2 days. The Italian Renaissance. What a great topic. Over here I put the Primates acronym and the timeline of the Renaissance, which I think is already on your title, your topic sheets. Today, the hope is that we definitely will, review your readings, and we will discuss what happened politically with the Renaissance. We'll definitely talk about what happened economically with the Renaissance. We will definitely today get through the social element of it. And then tomorrow we'll probably have more of a focus on what happened as far as in the arts and technology and innovation. And towards the end of the unit, we'll get into what was going on religiously during the Renaissance. But today, for sure, we'll get through the economic, the political, and the social, just to get in our frame of mind. Still with me? All right. So before every topic, I always pull up the title slide. And even though we're going to be discussing all of these themes, the political, the economic, the religious, we always have a central theme coming out of your CED. And when we study the Italian Renaissance, our theme is going to be cultural and intellectual development. So we really want to focus on what happened culturally. And the skill that we want to focus on is causation, or what you guys know from 10th grade as recognizing cause and effect. I always read through these objectives, but just know that your responses on your SAQ are going to answer these questions, so you're going to get them. Okay? So here are our objectives the next 2 days. We want to explain the context in which the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery developed. We actually already started that, right? Those posters on the wall. Learning objective B, explain how the revival of classical texts contributed to the development of the Renaissance in Italy. You guys probably already know, where did the Renaissance Italians look back to for inspiration for their rebirth of art and learning? What 2 cultures did they reach back to? The Greeks and the Romans, right? What we call the classics. The last objective is to explain the political, intellectual, and cultural effect of the Italian Renaissance, which we will most definitely do. All right. So class, I know some of you have differing backgrounds in this topic. If you've taken the mainstream world history class here at Lincoln, you got a whole unit on the Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance. Forgive me, some of you taken AP World with Mr. Fluth. Do they still cover the Renaissance in AP World?
We didn't last year.
Did not? Okay. So for some of you, is this your first introduction to the Renaissance? This is exciting. So the first thing we want to say is the Renaissance, the word literally translates into, it means rebirth. And your associative brain then asks the question, rebirth of what? Well, it was a rebirth of art and learning. And you guys know why we would say there was a rebirth, because you know what preceded the Renaissance. It was the Dark Ages. Remember, during the Dark Ages, after Rome had collapsed, people retreated to the rural areas. There was a complete loss of learning and literacy, with the exception of monks and nuns in the monasteries. There's a complete breakdown of the traditional economy, and people had resorted to the feudal world, right? But what was the darkest moment of the Dark Ages? What's going to have the biggest impact on putting Europe in the darkness? It was the bubonic plague, and the amount of social and economic and political disruption that would cause would be unbelievable. So when we say that the Renaissance kind of marks the transition from the Dark Ages, and then we transition into the Renaissance, and it lays the foundation for the modern world that's going to develop, that's why this is such a big marker in European and Western history. When people study the Renaissance, we most oftentimes associate it with the great artistic movements, right? The Leonardo da Vinci, the Michelangelo, the Raphael. And that is a big deal, and we're going to focus on it. But I think even more important is how things changed culturally from the Dark Ages into the modern world. And the first word that we're going to focus on here is secularism. Class, to live secular. Very important concept. A lot of times the word secular in most academia means non-religious, but we need to dig a little deeper. Some textbooks define secular as people starting to focus on the here and the now, right? Or your textbook likes to put it in the form of the process of becoming concerned with material, worldly things rather than spiritual or religious things. Why did this come about? Well, it's actually a pretty easy explanation. In 1347, when the bubonic plague hit Europe, right? It hit Florence, and then it spread across the continent rapidly. In 5 years, we see 20 to 50 million people die in 5 years. So many people are dying of the bubonic plague that death carts roll into European villages to gather the bodies, and huge heaps of corpses are burned at the edge of town every day. Imagine what this would do to your psyche to see 1 in 4, right? 2 in 4 people die every week of plague. People start to question the existence of who? God. And if they didn't question the existence of God, many people started to believe that God was punishing them. So people started to live secular, which means they started to focus on enjoying worldly pleasures, material pleasures. They thought to themselves, you know what? I've seen so much death, and I might be dead within the next week. I'm not going to sit here and live in that old fashion where I live meek and poor like the Bible tells me to live and focus solely on getting to heaven. I'm going to live it up right now. I'm going to eat fine food. I'm going to wear fine clothes. I'm going to party. I'm going to festival. I'm going to enjoy myself because I might not be here in a week. This was much different than the Middle Ages, right? People in the Middle Ages were devoutly Christian. They lived their Bible by what the priests and monks and nuns told them to live. And how did the Bible tell them to live? Meek and poor like Jesus, in hopes of getting where? To heaven. But now they started to live secular. Are we good on the vocab word secular? It's a big one. All right, so let's look specifically at what happened economically during this Renaissance period, 1300 to 1500. We start to see Europe recover from the Dark Ages economically. And this Renaissance had its birth in the Italian city-states, specifically a city-state called Florence, Italy. We know that Italian merchants started to see a revival in imports and exports and, in general, maritime activity. And one specific merchant family named the Medicis started to thrive in exporting cloth or textiles. After the plague had run its course, people started to travel again freely without fear. And we start to see an economic recovery happen to the point where Italian city-states like Milan, like Naples, like Florence, like Venice, they start to challenge what was the dominant maritime trade system, the Hanseatic League. Class, let me show you the Hanseatic League here. Throughout much of the late Middle Ages, this was the dominant trade system. And it wasn't down in the Mediterranean, it was up in the Baltic Sea and North Atlantic. The Hanseatic League was a collection of almost Germanic and Slavic states. The most dominant of these merchant states was Lubeck. But you can see here that Riga, Danzig, which is in modern day Poland, Hamburg, even London, Bruges, which is in modern day Belgium, Bergen, which is in modern day Norway, Novgorod, which is in modern day Ukraine and Western Russia. These were the dominant trading sites of the Hanseatic League. And despite they were hit by the plague and definitely had a lot of economic despair, but it was the Mediterranean that was hit a little harder, right? So once the plague had ran its course and Europe started to recover, we start to see the city-states of Italy challenge the Hanseatic League. Any questions so far? Yep.
Was the Wolf family like the ones who really wanted those paintings and stuff?
The which family?
The one with like the family who did like fabric or whatever.
Oh, the Medicis?
Were they the ones who wanted those commissions or paintings?
So we will learn that the Medici family in the rise to power were the main patrons or financial supporters of the major artists of the Renaissance. They were patronizing Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, for sure. Yeah. So class, take a look here. The wealthy merchant family that we associate with the Renaissance right here are the Medicis, and they were based out of Florence, right? Let's take a look at this Renaissance portrait of the Medicis. Just looking at the portrait, how do we know the Medicis were wealthy? Okay, let's go with the clothing first, right? The armor, the pearls, the jewelry. This little ditty right here is synonymous with the Renaissance. It's called a Shakespearean collar, made out of lace, would have been very expensive. And then what was the second one? Somebody said because it's a pretty well done portrait, right? That's true. Just the fact that they had a portrait tells us that they were wealthy. There's no photography back then, right? If you want history to remember what your family looked like, you're going to have to commission somebody to paint a portrait, and that obviously costs money. This is Lorenzo the Magnificent Medici and his family, and they were ruling out of Florence. The Florentine merchants, as well as the other merchants of Italy, started to challenge the northern trade routes of the Hanseatic League. Here is a picture of Lubeck, which would have been the most dominant of the northern trading cities. But whether you were a trader in the Mediterranean or somebody up in North Europe, all Europeans were dealing with the same problem at this point by the 1400s. They wanted access to Far Eastern spices and silks, but who was cutting off their land routes in the Middle East and North Africa? The Ottomans, right, and their predecessors. And as we'll make the connection in later chapters, that's why many of these European explorers are going to risk their lives and sail out into the West to try to find an alternate route to the East Indies. So, by 1500, the Flanders fleet of Venice began to challenge the Hanseatic League, which had dominated the timber, fish, grain, metals, honey, and wine trade. The Mediterranean traders benefited also from the Hanseatic League dealing with a big change in the herring migration during this time period. The Hanseatic League up here in the Baltic and the North Sea, their main commodity of trade was fishing herring and then using white gold or salt to preserve those fish. And that was the main commodity that was traded amongst these countries. And they were at the mercy of the whim. If the herring migration changed course in the North Sea and the Baltic, that would change which cities would be dominant in trade, right? Something as natural as that could disrupt things. All right. So, everybody good as far as what's going on economically? The rise of the Italian merchant states, specifically the Medicis. There we go. I just want to show you a good picture of what the two most dominant Italian city-states looked like back in the day. Here is the city of Florence on the left, and here is the city of Venice on the right. Take a look at Florence. Why would something like the bubonic plague spread so rapidly in a medieval European city like this?
Everything is so close together.
Yeah, right. Population density, right? People living on top of each other in very close quarters, small streets. The plague would have spread very rapidly through Florence, and it did beginning in 1347. You guys probably know that Florence was the most dominant and wealthy of the Italian city-states at the end of the Dark Ages. With their access to some of those markets of the Far East, they had actually developed a trading relationship that was at times civil with the Ottomans, and at times they went to war with the Ottomans. We know that the Venetian merchants lived in a republic, which we'll discuss here in a little bit. Even the Venetians were so powerful and wealthy at some point, they were in the Middle Ages, they were performing the act of the Crusades to the Middle East, right? All right. So let's change our mode here and let's talk about what things were like socially during this time period. A very different world than the one that we live in. Coming out of the late Middle Ages, late Dark Ages, we know that almost all of these European kingdoms and states had a social structure that was similar to the one you see on the screen, where the population of a kingdom or a state was categorized into three social classes called estates. If you guys took 10th grade world history and you learned about the French Revolution, you already know your three estates, right? In the first estate, that was always the clergy, the Catholic Church. The Pope, who lived in the Vatican and sometimes in Avignon, was obviously the political leader of Europe. And it would be the Pope that would crown the Holy Roman Emperor, the political leader of Central Europe. But then each one of the kings across Europe would then give privileged status to people that were cardinals and bishops and priests and monks and nuns. And the Catholic Church, for the most part, would give this first estate status, and the people that belonged to the first estates were usually exempted from taxes. And they were large landowners because they had the monasteries and the churches and the cathedrals on their lands. In the second estate, people belonged to the nobility. We have a lot of different words for the nobility. Aristocrats. In Russia, they're called boyars. In Germany, they're called Junkers. In England, we call them lords. In Spain, we call them the Cortes, right? There's different names for these people, but what is a noble? A noble is somebody that is a wealthy landowner that has been given that status by the king. In typical European states, that they made up 2 to 3% of the population, they usually owned at least a quarter of the country, and once again, they paid how much in taxes to the king? Here. They were given positions of status. Usually they were the ones given positions in government, and they were the heads of military, but they were an elevated status. And in most of these countries, the nobles would actually challenge the monarchs. We will see those dynamics playing out. But for most people living in Europe, they belong to the third estate. And 85 to 90% of people found themselves in this class. They were the laborers, from the wealthier of the working class all the way down to the poorest of the poor, and they were responsible for paying all of the taxes. It was not allowed in many of these countries for people to marry outside of their estate, right? Obviously, people in the clergy weren't marrying at all, but somebody of noble status wasn't marrying a peasant. So that kind of gives us a general overview of what the social classes were like in Europe, in most European states. And a lot of what we know about specifically social classes in Italy at the time come from a book that some of you have read portions of this in 10th grade. If you haven't read portions of this, I did post it to Canvas under modules. It's a quick read, it's good stuff. So the author of this guidebook on how to be a Renaissance man, his name is Baldassare Castiglione. It's kind of a mouthful. Baldassare Castiglione wrote the book The Courtier. In class, when you look at this word, the courtier, what's the base word? Court, right? What does it mean back then if you are a young man to whom this guidebook is written for, and you're trying to court a young lady? Much different than what we do today. If you're trying to court somebody, you're trying to prove yourself worthy of marriage, right? So Baldassare Castiglione wrote a guidebook for young men and young women that tells them what a Renaissance man and a Renaissance woman, what attributes they should have, right? And by reading this book, this little guidebook, you get a good idea of what separated people culturally and as far as their status. If you were somebody of a noble family, you would be expected to know the art of combat, how to swing a sword, to protect your lady. You should be literate in 2 languages, Latin and Greek. You should be humble. You should have integrity. You should be a musician to the point where you should play multiple instruments and be able to read music. You should be able to paint. You should be knowledgeable in politics. In essence, class, you need to be well-rounded in the humanities, right? Humanism, which we'll get into a second here. But I do encourage you guys, if you have the opportunity, to read a chunk of the Courtier, which I posted under Canvas. I was going to show you where, but it's just under modules. And if you guys took 10th grade world history with me, it's the same excerpt that we read in class, but not a bad idea. So, reading a book like The Courtier, we would get an idea of what family relations were like in Italy. Family relations were a bit different than what we know in the Western world today. Back in Renaissance Italy, it wasn't just like the nuclear family like we have today with mom and dad and the kids living in one household. The pattern back then would be parents, children, people of the nobility had servants living with them, grandparents, widowed mothers, unmarried sisters. It would have been kind of a larger family dynamic. Marriage back then was far different than it is today. Rarely did somebody back then marry for love. Marriages were arranged by the male head of the household, and usually marriages were implemented for some type of political gain, political alliance, or to ensure the financial security of the family or the offspring. If you had a young daughter and you wanted to marry her off, you would have to attach a dowry to her, which was kind of a financial package to make her appealing. And if you were a son, you were usually, like we said, married off to somebody that would improve your social status in society. Women were expected to remain at home. Mothers were expected to be pregnant every other year through their fertile years. So imagine that. From menstruation to menopause, a woman was expected to be pregnant every other year through her adult years. Why is that? Why did people have to have such big families? What's that?
The bloodline.
Okay, to make sure the bloodline continued, but also for reasons of what's that?
All the kids just died.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, for sure. Once again, so the family line lived on because, like we said here, most children died before the age of 20, right? In birth, disease was much more rampant. But people needed larger families to continue the bloodline, but this was more of an agricultural world, right? A pre-agrarian
Farm
society, farming. You needed more farm hands and labor. Now, sexual norms during the Renaissance. Remember, these people are still living in a very Christian society, but there was different norms for men and women. Marriages ranged from some people having like legitimate emotional attachment where they did, even though the marriages were arranged, they eventually learned to love the person they were with. And then sometimes these marriages were just straight up no emotional attachment. It was just a formal tie. And it was very common in situations like these for men to seek relationships outside of the marriage. Prostitution was frowned upon in many city states, but it was there. Brothels were rampant. And in some of the more liberal cities, the nobility would actually tax the brothels, and it was completely legal. It wasn't frowned upon for a man to do something outside his marital relationship, but it definitely was illegal for women to do the same. So we definitely see different standards for men and women. Women actually faced execution for extramarital relationships where men did not. All right. So we got through what's going on economically with the recovery. We kind of gave a little bit of an overview of what was like socially, looking at social classes and the family patterns. Let's end today by looking at what's going on politically. And then this is going to set us up for what we'll focus on tomorrow with characteristics of the actual rebirth, right? The flowering of the arts and the humanities. So class, very important here today that you get an understanding of the geography of Italy. It's good to know for this unit, but it's good to know in general for the entirety of this class. So let's look at Italy. At this point in history, we do not have an Italian nation like we have today. Italy had about 10 different kingdoms, 5 to 7 of which were very wealthy and dominant and would play a vital role in the shaping of the Renaissance. So let's take a look here. The most dominant of the Italian city-states at this point was in the north with the city-state of Venice, the Republic of Venice. Obviously, it's access to the Adriatic Sea. It's dealing with the trade routes of the Far East and the Ottomans in the East. Venice was the most wealthy and dominant city-state through the Dark Ages and at the beginning of the Renaissance. Its competitor to the west was the Duchy of Milan. And then eventually, with the Medicis family and their growth of wealth and prestige, the people that dominated the regions of Tuscany, right? The Florentine Republic, the people of Florence. It would be Milan and Venice that would dominate the north, and much of the wealth and power of Italy was found in the north. As you get farther south, you see that the third great state of importance was the Papal States. And obviously, when we use the word papal, we're dealing with who was in control? The Pope. Obviously, the political power was centered in Rome. But as the Great Schism happened, and as we start to see this period where we had 2 to 3 different popes and the papacy was moved to Avignon, right, in southern France, we start to see the rise of other city-states like Urbino, Bologna, Ferrara. Now, the fifth of these city-states was the Kingdom of Naples, and that was in the southern part of the Italian peninsula. Naples also controlled that island off the coast of Italy, which was Sicily, and even parts of Sardinia. Right? We know that out of the 5 more dominant city-states, Naples was the poorest. So, Venice, Milan, Florence, Papal States, Naples. Good? All right, so what's going on politically in Italy in the 1400s? There was a system that we will call a balance of power trying to be maintained, right? Where people were forming alliances and breaking alliances and going to war with one another, seeking power through political marriages, right? There was a balance of power that was constantly being played out on the Italian peninsula. And we know that with the rise and the prominence of Venice, we know that Milan and Florence would form an alliance to try to keep Venice from growing too powerful and expanding their empire to the west. But it didn't stop us from continually having these bouts of warfare between the Italian city-states. And they were different politically. Milan was an oligarchy. Florence was an oligarchy that masked itself as a republic. Venice was the most democratic. It was being run by a bunch of merchants that would call a council and vote their decisions and leaders. They were by far the most Republican, but they were still dominated by merchant oligarchs. Obviously, the Papal States were dominated by the Pope politically, and Naples was a monarchy. And we know that they would war with each other repeatedly for control over the peninsula. But eventually, we see a little bit of a breakthrough in 1454 with the Peace of Lade, where the balance of power eventually brought 40 years of peace. It would ultimately fail in bringing peace to the whole Italian peninsula, and it definitely didn't consolidate all of them into one state. But it did bring a little bit of peace at the beginning of the Renaissance period. Now, as this history plays out, and we know that Italy's inability to consolidate power into one monarch for the whole peninsula is going to leave it vulnerable to be dominated by two outside powers. From your reading this weekend, which two powers were constantly sticking their nose in Italy's business, both with their militaries and controlling trade and trying to get involved with controlling the Pope and the Church? What two countries were getting involved in Italian politics? The Valois family of France, which obviously geographically is very close to Italy, and Spain. The other country that's going to historically always be involved will be the Habsburgs of Austria. We're going to see that the Italians are going to be constantly dealing with the Austrians dominating the northern part of their lands. But as the story goes, in the early Renaissance period, Venice rises to power and prominence and wealth. Milan and Florence band together with Naples to put an end to this dominance. The Venetians, with their dominant military and wealth, are going to conquer much of that region. So the Duke of Milan runs to France, to Charles VIII, to come in and bring his army to halt this expansion. And in inviting in French troops, that was a big mistake, because the French troops would then march down the western coast and claim Naples. But who is the opposition to the Valois? Who does not want to see the French get their foot in Italy? Right? The country of Spain. Right? The Aragonese, and eventually when Spain becomes controlled by the Habsburgs, right? We see this constant dynamic. And in this case, Spain comes in, ousts the French from the control that they had just taken, and by the end of this Renaissance period, we see that the Spanish, right, in intervening, would dominate Italy. So, in general, class, Italy is disfragmented. It is not politically united, nor are many of these states at the time. But at this point, they were being dominated by France and Spain. So I think tomorrow a good place for us to start is going to be with the publishing of probably the second most important work beyond the Courtier, which would be Machiavelli's publishing of The Prince.